Hello, AP Worlders. We are going to discuss the spread of industrialization. Alright, industrialization didn't just stay in Britain for long. First, it spread to other countries in Europe, and then eventually to the United States, Russia, and Japan. Each place had similar outcomes with dealing with this spread of industrialization. Alright, one, new technologies and sources of energy generated a vast increase in production. Two, they went through urbanization. Three, class structures changed, and there was a new middle class that's going to grow in prominence. And four, working women were paid less, and there were poor working conditions that are going to lead to unions and socialist movements. There's also some differences with how industrialization spread to these places. And that was going to be based on the different histories, culture, and societies. For example, France, industrialization happened much slower. In Germany, they're going to focus on heavy industry like iron, steel, and coal production rather than textiles like Britain. Industrialization in the United States and in Russia would transform them majorly. Through industrialization, the United States would become a global power, and Russia would end up going through a revolution that would have them become the first communist society. Alright, here's a map that shows the gradual spread of industrialization throughout Europe. Alright, let's first look at the United States. The Industrial Revolution in the United States began in the textile mills of New England. Alright, so that's similar to Britain because they began in textiles as well. The huge size and availability of natural resources and a stable government enabled the United States to produce 36% of the world's manufactured goods by 1914. About a third of the capital investment that's going to finance this industrialization in the United States is going to come from investors in Europe. The U.S. are going to make some advancements to the Industrial Revolution. They're going to create new techniques such as interchangeable parts and the assembly line, as well as advertising. Socialism had less of an effect in the United States. There never was a major political party that was a socialist party that's going to rise. And the workers never adopted to socialism as much as they did in Europe. The workers were more unionized in the United States. So you can see from this bar graph the number of manufactured workers, how it's going to rise in the United States. Now let's look at Russia. Russia, pre-Industrial Revolution, was the sole place that still had an absolute monarchy. They had no political parties, no parliament, and no elections. Most Russians were serfs that were bound to the land and could be sold, and they often were exploited. The nobles were westernized, but the serfs never became westernized. If you remember, in Russia, change to industrialization was initiated by the state in its effort to catch up to Europe. The traditions of trying to catch up with Europe stayed strong throughout Russia. All right. Previously, we learned about Peter the Great, Catherine the Great in the early modern period when they tried to westernize Russia. So Russia had, a history of trying to imitate and catch up to Europe. And so now that they saw Europe was industrializing, they also felt the need to industrialize. So the first thing Russia decided to do was to free the serfs in 1861, which is around the same time that slaves in the United States are going to be freed. After Russia loses the Crimean War, here's a map. You can see where the Crimean War was fought around this area. Right, there's Crimea. But after Russia loses that war, the British and the French are going to help defeat the Russians there. And during the war, the British and the French weapons proved to the Russians just how far behind they were and how they needed or why they needed to industrialize. So Russia decides to industrialize. And Russia also is going to have big foreign investments that's going to help fuel or pay for this industrialization. As the middle class is going to grow in Russia because of this industrial revolution, they're going to start to resent the Tsarist Russia, and they wanted a greater role in political life. There also was a growing radicalism of the workers. And by 1898, an illegal labor party was created, and they began to educate workers and organize them. This illegal labor party followed socialism. By 1905, following another military loss, this time to Japan, Russia is going to erupt in an insurrection or uprising. The 1905 uprising was brutally suppressed, but it did bring some changes to Russia. They're going to legalize unions, legalize political parties, and they're going to create a national assembly called the Duma, D-U-M-A. They also are going to expand education to more people. However, these changes didn't ease the social and political problems of Russia, and a revolution was going to seem unavoidable. World War I is going to provide that moment to bring about the revolutions. The hardships of World War I and the social tensions of industrialization is going to spark that revolution in 1917. We're going to talk more about the Russian Revolution when we get to the modern era, when we cover World War I. But the Bolsheviks would win this revolution, and they were led by their leader, Lenin, and create a socialist state there in Russia. All right, now let's go to Latin America. Latin America, India, Egypt, and Ottoman Empire, and China all had small attempts at industrializing. It was far from having the major social transformation that took place in Britain, Europe, Japan, and North America. The struggle for independence in Latin America lasted longer and was more destructive than it was in North America. The independence wars led to decimated populations, diminished agriculture, and livestock. Political life was turbulent. The conservatives, they wanted to go back to a similar style of the old regime from when they were controlled by the Europeans. They wanted a centralized government. The liberals, they wanted some of the Enlightenment values that were changed in Europe. Conflicts between these two groups enabled military leaders, known as caudillos, spelled C-A-U-D-I-L-L-O-S, to achieve power as defenders of order and property. All right, so sort of like military regimes are going to take control in Latin America. The most significant economic outcome of the industrialized interactions with Latin America was Latin America's growing exports to industrialized countries. Industrialized countries needed the food production, raw materials, and the markets that Latin America provided. Mexico would produce silver. They would get copper from Chile. They would get rubber from the Amazon. Bananas, beef, coffee, sugar were also other goods that Latin America would provide to these industrial companies, or not companies, countries. Latin Americans are going to import textiles, machinery, tools, weapons, and luxury goods from Europe and the United States. All right, but the problem is going to be they're going to become so dependent upon these industrialized countries. All right, they're going to depend on them, one, to take their raw materials, but also they're going to depend on them to import their industrialized goods. So that's going to be a major problem for them, that dependency. But Latin America wanted to be like Europe. And focusing on raw materials was their attempt to be more like Europe. Their economies started growing at first. The population was booming and people were urbanizing. They even sought to attract more Europeans to move there, promising the poor whites in Europe, if they moved there, that they would gain riches. But the majority of the population of Latin America never saw any of the benefits from this export boom. The majority of the low class lived in rural areas and ended up being dependent laborers on haciendas. In Mexico, these inequalities are going to erupt into a revolution. Porfirio Diaz was the leader, and there was a peasant uprising led by Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. But unlike the Russians and the Chinese, their revolution didn't have the same long-term effects. But they did have some changes in Mexico. There was a new constitution created. The universal male suffrage was allowed in Mexico. There was a redistribution of the land, the rights of the workers, more rights for workers, and the minimum wage rose. The most significant outcome of the export boom in Latin America of raw materials lay in what did not happen. Latin America never industrialized. And as I said before, Latin America became dependent upon the countries of that had industrialized. The United States would align themselves with landowners and politicians in these Latin American countries, and they would form what were called banana republics. And banana republics was where the United States would kind of control the politics and the landowners to get favorable raw materials and trade. All right, so the United States wanted to maintain favorable conditions to the growth of the United States. The United States would often interfere militarily in countries if leaders tried to ruin these relationships. We're going to talk more about this also in the modern era. So in a way, the United States stunted Latin America's growth to benefit the growth of the United States and keep them dependent upon us, right? So if the Latin America stayed dependent on the United States, it would be better for us, for our growth. All right, so that's everything for now for the spread of the Industrial Revolution and also Latin America. One other place where the Industrial Revolution is going to spread is Japan, and that will be covered a little bit later in class. All right, I'll see you guys in class.